Okay, welcome to lecture for chapter 26, the Cold War from 1945 to 1960, or as this slide would seem to suggest how communists took over America, which is not entirely true at all. This lecture is probably going to be a bit more condensed than some of the previous ones because I actually talked about quite a few of these details in class, and doing that concept map. Sorry, I forgot the term for a moment there. And doing that in class, I actually talked about a lot of the details on here. So this one is actually going to be fairly condensed. I'll give a little bit more detail about things that I kind of skimmed over in class. But for things that I felt I covered fairly well, we'll just sort of skim over them in this. If, however, you didn't write down anything in class, all of this information is conveniently located in chapter 26 in the textbook. So you do still have it at your fingertips. Regardless of the fact that I may not cover it extensively in this lecture. So with that in mind, we are going to get started and hopefully not have you sitting here for hours on end. I'm going to attempt to do the entire chapter in one lecture, so we'll see how it goes, okay? Okay, so one of the first things I talked about was what the world looked like after the end of the Second World War. And what you get is the Red Army occupies pretty much the entire eastern half of Europe at the war's end, and Stalin has a vested interest in creating a kind of buffer zone between himself and the West because Eastern European countries, namely Poland, have now been used twice within the 20th century, within the past sort of 40, 30 years, as a sort of springboard for an aggressive German nation to attack Russia or the Soviet Union. And Stalin wants to avoid that. So he starts to kind of mold Eastern Europe into a Soviet Union friendly area. He installs a lot of puppet governments and things like that basically do whatever he tells them to. And they get into quite a disagreement over Poland. Truman comes into the situation fairly unprepared. He's not had to deal with Stalin. He wasn't particularly brought in on any of the foreign policy decisions under Roosevelt. And so he goes in sort of with something to prove, which is not a terribly good attitude to come in with. He's very eager to demonstrate that he is commanding, that he can match Stalin, and so they butt heads over Poland especially, and it really helps to further deteriorate relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. His assertiveness, as well as Stalin's already sort of pretty substantial mistrust of the West generally, just sort of combines to increase the mistrust that Stalin has of the West and his obsession with his own security. He stepped up the confiscation of materials and factories from the occupied territories. He forced his sort of satellite nations to close their doors to American trade and influence. In a speech given at the White House, Truman came down really hard on Soviet action with regard to this. And so what you have is the introduction of Truman's containment policy. George Kennan, who was the sort of author of the containment policy, reasoned that the only way to deal with the Soviet aggressiveness was a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. Truman had already insisted that we'd come to the point where we had to stop babying the Soviets and to get tough with them, and so was more than willing to accept this advice from Kennan, and it served as the basis for the containment policy. The policy mainly utilized military, economic, as well as diplomatic strategies to curb, or rather contain, any further Soviet communist expansion, and it pretty much became gospel in Washington during Truman's presidency. In March of 1946, he accompanies Winston Churchill to Westminster College in Missouri, where Churchill gives a warning that Stalin and communism are a new threat to democracy, and first used the phrase Iron Curtain, where he described that Stalin had in fact drawn an iron curtain across the eastern half of Europe. And in order to meet the threat, he proposed an alliance of English-speaking peoples and a maintenance of American Anglo control over nuclear weapons as well. As mutual hostility escalates between the Soviets and the Americans, both of them rush to create doomsday weapons. In June, Truman submitted to the United Nations a plan to destroy the atomic arsenal of the United States, which has grown considerably from the 2 bombs that we had at the time of the Japanese bombing. But he made the destruction of the American arsenal contingent upon the Soviets stopping all work on nuclear weapons and submitting to UN inspections. The Soviets refused to do so, and so Congress responds by creating the Atomic Energy Commission, with a focus on both looking at nuclear energy for peaceful means, but with perhaps a larger focus on developing even more nuclear weaponry. Less than a year after American and Soviet soldiers had met on the Elbe River, fighting a common enemy in Nazi Germany, the Cold War emerges, and it would be waged for over 2 decades and use pretty much any means except direct military confrontation. In February 1947, Britain informed the United States they could no longer afford to assist Greece and Turkey, and this led to Truman resolving to meet the challenge to continue to fund them in their struggles against communist coups, essentially. Congressional leaders not 100% behind this, but they agreed to assist the president only if he could get the nation to agree to it. He managed to do that on March 12th, 1947, asked for $400 million in military assistance from Congress to Greece and Turkey, and what became known as the Truman Doctrine. He presented the matter as a global struggle in making this speech, a struggle between alternate ways of life, a holy war between God-fearing democracy and an atheistic communism, which relied on terror and oppression. And in doing so, he set up that ideological dichotomy, which I talked fairly extensively about in class. This kind of unilateral declaration as well proclaimed the United States' intention to become a sort of global policeman, which is a position that we still hold, really, within the world. In order to back up this new international initiative, Congress also passed the National Security Act in 1947, which unified the armed forces under the Department of Defense, created a National Security Council to advise the president on strategic matters, established the Central Intelligence Agency to gather information, essentially. They also approved the administration's proposal for a massive U.S. assistance for a European recovery plan. This plan was proposed by the Secretary of State, George Marshall, thus named the Marshall Plan, and it allocated billions of dollars to help Europe recover from what was a devastating war. In Europe, all the countries that participated saw massive expansion of their economies, prosperity returned. All of those that didn't take part, mainly Stalin's Eastern Bloc that he's setting up, still sort of mired in economic stagnation. The Soviet Union responded to the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan by tightening further its grip on Eastern Europe. In the Potsdam Agreement, as I mentioned before, Germany was divided into 4 sections, and the Western nations were considering combining their sections. And this led Stalin to respond by cutting off surface access to his section, Berlin being in Stalin's section. And so the sort of caretakers of West Germany couldn't get to West Berlin, which was also within their area of influence. And so Truman came up with the idea of the Berlin airlift, where they would get supplies to Berlin that way, to West Berlin that way. Eventually, Russia, or the Soviets, saw that their strategy of closing off surface access was not useful, and so they relented. In May of 1949, the U.S., Britain, and France ended their occupation of Germany, and about a month earlier, 10 Western European nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty, which established a military alliance in which an armed attack against one or more of them should be considered an armed attack against all. And this created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and formally ended America's very long isolationist tradition. The Soviet Union responded with the creation of the Warsaw Pact, which essentially did the exact same thing with his Eastern Bloc that he'd already been sort of setting up. Again, I mentioned that you had similar problems in China, where a nationalist government was fighting against communist insurgents under Mao Zedong. But you also have other areas of Asia which are being affected in this. The hostility that we see in essentially carving Europe in half also translates over to Asia, and you see the attempts to sort of carve other places up into communist and capitalist regions. The Russians created a sphere of influence in Manchuria. Americans denied Moscow any kind of role in post-war Japan, and so you see the partitioning of Korea happen as a result of this sort of headbutting. As the head of the U.S. occupation forces in Japan, General MacArthur oversaw that nation's transformation from an empire in ruins to a rather prosperous democracy. And in 1952, we ended the occupation of Japan, and a military security treaty allowed the U.S. to retain its Japanese bases, and it brought Japan underneath our sort of protective umbrella, if you like. We also helped to crush pro-communist insurgents in the Philippines. We aided the French to reestablish the colonial rule in Indochina, or Vietnam. That aid would come back to bite us a couple of decades on, as we move to get into a rather long conflict in Vietnam much later. The loss of China to the Reds was shocking to Americans. The most populous nation in the world, who was seen as kind of a counterforce to communism and a massive market for American goods, had all of a sudden become Red China. And so you start to see some people playing the blame game to try and figure out who it was that actually lost China to the communists. While that's going on, the president announced in 1949, in September of 1949, that the Soviet Union had exploded their own atomic bomb. The loss of our nuclear monopoly also sort of shattered America's illusions and led to a massive anti-communist hysteria, as people very fervently looked for reasons for our setbacks and failures on the world stage. You see ordinary Americans seeking safety in civil defense. Public schools had air raid drills, as I described. Americans volunteered to be sky watchers to find Soviet spy planes flying overhead. More than 1 million purchased or constructed their own bomb shelters for their houses. In January of 1950, somewhat stung by the charges that he was being soft on communism, Truman ordered the development of a fusion-based hydrogen bomb, which had the capability of being 1,000 times more destructive than the atomic bomb used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In November of 1952, we exploded our first H-bomb, but our competitive edge with the Soviet Union, was short-lived, as a mere 9 months later, the Soviets detonated their own H-bomb. Nuclear tests left minimally protected U.S. soldiers as well as South Pacific Islanders, because it was, in fact, in the South Pacific Islands that we controlled, where we did all of our testing. When we detonated the H-bomb, they detonated it over a uninhabited island as part of the Marshall Island chain, and that island was completely wiped off the map. It left a massive crater in the ocean floor. And we were starting to become aware of the consequences of nuclear fallout now that we're sort of on a little ways from the actual original tests. The Atomic Energy Commission insisted that the fallout was harmless, but many people were exposed to radiation, as well as a lot of unborn children who would ultimately pay the cost for this kind of out-of-control arms race. In April of 1950, a committee was appointed to analyze U.S. defense policy, and they issued the report NSC 68, which emphasized Soviet aggression and territorial greed, and advised that the U.S. needed to increase its nuclear arsenal, undertake vigorous covert action, and pretty much allow for open-ended increases in the defense budget in order to resist communism. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, after the Second World War, the United States and Soviet Union temporarily, or at least the intention was to temporarily, divide Korea. It had been controlled by Japan since the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and was divided along the 38th parallel. This line then solidified into a sort of de facto border between the Soviet-backed Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north, and the American-supported Republic of Korea in the south, each one claiming the sole right to rule all of the Korean peninsula. On June 25, 1950, North Korean troops swept across the 38th parallel in order to attack South Korea. The South Koreans were overwhelmed quite easily, and they were pushed all the way down into the very bottom corner of the peninsula. You can see on the map on the right-hand side at the bottom, there's a little purple line. That's where the line was. That very tip corner was the part that the South Koreans still controlled. The North controlled everything else, so nearly taking the entire peninsula in the first movement of the war. Very mindful of the failure that appeasement provided in the Munich Accords with Hitler in 1938, it was believed that the communists were doing in Korea exactly what Hitler had done and what the Japanese had done in the 30s. And so Truman didn't want to be seen as another Neville Chamberlain, another sort of weak leader who wanted to give in to aggressive forces. And so without consulting Congress, he ordered air and naval forces to Korea on June 27th. He asked the United Nations to authorize an action to repel the invasion, and since the Soviets were boycotting the United Nations, the UN approved a police action to restore South Korea's border. The important thing to note here is to restore the border at the 38th parallel. North Korean forces initially remained successful. However, in mid-September, with UN forces sort of cornered in that southeastern tip, General MacArthur, who was in command of UN forces, executed an amphibious maneuver, landing his troops at Incheon, which you can see a little blue arrow on the left side showing you where Incheon is, pretty much right at the 38th parallel or just below it. UN forces managed to drive the North Koreans back across the 38th parallel, and MacArthur managed to persuade Truman to let him go beyond the UN mandate to simply restore South Korea and actually liberate all of Korea from communism. And so UN troops push all the way up to the north. And so you can see a sort of blue line kind of swooping from through North Korea right on the Chinese border. That's as far as he got. The Yalu River is the border between China and Korea. The Chinese were becoming a little antsy, seeing this military force, coming closer and closer to their border. They feared that America's commitment to liberate China and return it to the nationalists um, would be an objective, as well as liberating all of North Korea. And so they warned the Americans that they would not sit back and simply watch as the Americans moved closer and closer to the border. MacArthur completely dismissed the threat. He very greatly underestimated the worth of Chinese troops, which was definitely a very appalling decision, actually, move on his part. And he deployed his forces in a rather thin line just below the river. On November 25th, 3 Chinese divisions, about 300,000 men, counterattacked and drove MacArthur's forces back down below the 38th parallel. And by March of 51, the fighting had deadlocked completely. And the rest of the war just pretty much dissolved into a stalemate. And it remained stalemated until 1953, 1954, almost. It was a very long and very painful engagement, actually. I don't know if any of you have ever seen the TV show MASH, but while it is funny and it is entertaining, it's also very interesting, and they deal with some pretty heavy topics with regards to the Korean War. And just recently, they showed the finale, actually on Veterans Day. They showed the finale of MASH, which is apparently not shown on television all that often. And it deals with the actual end of the war. In 1954, I believe it was actually ended. And it's a very interesting story, and if you ever get the chance to watch it, I highly encourage you to do so. The Korean War itself, however, had very major consequences for the United States. It accelerated the implementation of NSC 68. Truman had been, prior to this, kind of considering cutting back on our defense budget a little bit because he felt that it wasn't doing any good. But with the advent of the Korean War, you actually see very rapid adoption of NSC 68. The expansion of the containment doctrine generally becomes a sort of global commitment for the United States. As a result of this, defense spending zooms kind of out of control from $13 billion to $60 billion, and from 1/3 to a full 2/3 of the entire federal budget. The U.S. Army grew exponentially. The American atomic sort of stockpile grew exponentially. The United States acquired new bases around the world. They committed themselves to rearming West Germany and joined a mutual defense pact with Australia and New Zealand, which was eventually opened up to include various other Southeast Asian countries. Truman's intervention in Korea also preserved a rather precarious balance of power in Asia, but it also stepped up the administration's commitment to the sort of anti-communist struggle. Domestically, it served to enhance the powers of an already rather powerful presidency, thanks to Roosevelt before him, and it also set a precedent for future undeclared wars, which pretty much becomes the modus operandi for the United States, getting into undeclared wars. When the Second World War ended, GIs and civilians alike wanted those men to be brought back. They wanted to shrink the size, to shrink the size of the U.S. military and bring the boys home. One of the problems that we faced after the First World War was so many soldiers being discharged all at the same time created some strain on the economy. It was difficult to find jobs for them. Women were forced out of jobs, as we discussed in that chapter, and it was kind of difficult for the economy to keep up. So you have an attempt to try and mitigate all of these men coming and rejoining the workforce with the introduction of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, or more commonly referred to as the GI Bill. It was designed to sort of forestall the expected recession by sort of easing veterans back into the workforce and to reward them for their wartime service. The bill gave veterans priority for a lot of jobs, as well as some occupational guidance. They were eligible for a full year's worth of unemployment benefits. It provided rather low interest government loans to about 4 million of them who could use it to start businesses or to buy homes. It also promised to pay up to 4 years for further education, so going to college or going to community college, vocational school, anything like that. Those who took advantage of it to go to school were sort of stalled in entering the workforce, so it meant that the economy could sort of digest these workers more slowly, so as to not cause any massive economic problems. There were some Americans who opposed the bill, as they saw it as sort of a movement towards socialism, and there were some university administrators who feared the influx of just sort of anybody and everybody. By 1946, you have about 1.5 million veterans who are attending college, which spurred the creation of a lot of new state as well as community colleges. Most of them were married, fathers of children, and they were generally less interested in knowledge than in a degree that would get them a higher paying job. So you see a lot of interest in sort of vocational type programs. Colleges would offer accelerated programs and more vocation or career orientated courses in order to meet those new demands. In order to make room, a lot of colleges moved to limit the number of female students they admitted, or to bar students from out of state from attending the college. Despite possible setbacks or disadvantages of the bill, it did serve to democratize higher education. Institutions of higher learning were no longer seen as the sort of bastions of privilege. Universities awarded twice as many degrees in 1950 as they did in 1940, largely as a result of all of these veterans going to school. And as a result of them going to school, a lot of veterans were also sort of propelled into the middle class, so that 2 decades later, these much more affluent, well-educated veterans expected their children to follow suit and to also go to university. And so higher education becomes an accepted and possibly even a required part of the American dream moving forward. In 1945 as well, tax cuts equaling about $6 billion spurred a lot of corporate investment in new factories, new equipment, as well as an expanded workforce, which helped to produce an economic boom. Consumers who had been saving their money, rationing, wearing clothes until they were, threadbare and falling apart and various things like that, were really eager to spend all of those wartime savings now. And so this also contributes to the growth and prosperity and this kind of post-war economic boom. These people who had survived the Great Depression, who had survived the Second World War, now find themselves craving the good life. And the good life was to be had through the purchase of appliances, of cars, of new clothing, new products, everything that they could get their hands on. And a lot of it was now electrified. All of these new products, televisions, phonographs, automatic transmission, cars, freezers, air conditioners, all of these things become the sort of hallmark of middle class, living the dream sort of lifestyles. An agreement known as the Bretton Woods Agreement among the Western allies also set the stage for the United States to become an economic leader, at least in the non-communist world. It created institutions like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the general agreements on tariffs and trades that would break up sort of closed trading blocks and promote free trade throughout at least the Western world. All of these things helped to increase the United States standing because it increased our markets overseas for all of our products, and so it contributed to that economic boom as well. American firms could now import raw materials very cheaply from various different places, especially with so many nations suffering as a result of the war. They had very little competition from other industrial countries, especially because most of our industrial competition came from Western Europe, which was completely devastated by the war. Our exports were reaching record levels. U.S. economic dominance also resulted from a lot of advances we made in science and technology during the war. And this led to even more revolutionary developments in other industries, especially the electronics and plastics type industries. Americans' hunger for the fruits of affluence left them with very little appetite for extending the New Deal and its sort of welfare provisions. And so the only major domestic accomplishment that Truman managed in the 79th Congress was the Employment Act of 1946. This committed federal government spending to ensuring economic growth and establishing a council of economic advisors that would confer with the president in order to formulate policies that might maintain employment, production, purchasing power, essentially allowing for active guidance of the economy rather than just letting it do what it will. Congress, however, didn't really get behind it and managed to gut both the goal and the ability to carry it out. So it wasn't particularly useful. Congress's eagerness to dismantle wartime controls worsened the nation's main economic problem in this period, which was inflation. Consumer demand managed to outrun the supply of goods, which intensified the pressure on prices. The Office of Price Administration had been the one sort of responsible for price fixing, essentially. But in June of 46, Truman vetoed a bill that would have extended its life, but deprived it of power, effectively ending price controls. Food costs rose 16% within a week following the end of price controls, wartime price controls. Congress then passed and Truman signed a bill which extended the price controls in a sort of weakened form, but you have a lot of protests, especially from farmers and meat producers who want to end it because high prices benefit them at the expense of the consumer. As 1946 is an election year, a midterm election year, Truman lifted the controls in the hopes of encouraging Democratic victories. However, when Democrats lost control of Congress in 46 anyways, Truman pretty much ended all price controls because it wasn't seen as sort of politically helpful anymore. As a result, the price index jumped by 25%. So you have really high inflation in the United States. People are paying a lot more money for things than they would have done in previous periods. This sharp rise in prices and the shrinking size of paychecks goaded a lot of labor organizers into demanding higher wages. And in 1946 alone, you have more than 4.5 million workers on strike at any given time. By the fall of 1946, Truman had managed to anger most of the major interest groups by not really backing those labor organizers. And as we move into the midterm elections in 46, this is really what enables the Republicans to take control of Congress for the first time since they had lost it in 1928. The public mood was reflecting not just economic discontent, but also a kind of undercurrent of fear, which pretty much characterizes this period. And all of this sort of stemming from the Cold War. In 1946, Republicans managed to win control of Congress, like I say, and a lot of them interpreted this victory as a mandate to reverse the New Deal. The new Republican-controlled Congress defeated Democratic bills that proposed raising the minimum wage or to provide federal funds for education and housing. Congress managed to pass the Taft-Hartley Act in 1947, which barred a closed shop or a workshop where all employees had to join a union. So that was barred. You now have employees which are free to work at a place and not be in the union. The act also barred strikes against suppliers of targeted businesses and required union officials to sign anti-communist loyalty oaths. It also permitted the president to call a cooling off period in order to delay strikes that might endanger national safety or anything like that. The unions, of course, hated this law, and Truman eventually gave in to the union demands that he veto it. He did veto it, but Congress was able to quite easily override his veto. However, he had taken a major step towards sort of regaining the trust of the unions. Truman urged Congress to repeal the Taft-Hartley Act and to provide federal aid to education and housing, national health insurance, high farm price supporters. In order to woo ethnic voters, he railed against Soviet communism. To court Jewish American voters, he expressed sympathy toward the Holocaust survivors and extended diplomatic recognition to the new state of Israel when it was created in May of 1948, despite caution from his State Department advisors who felt that it would unnecessarily antagonize the Arab world. Still, Truman's chances for victory as we move into the 1948 election seemed to be fairly slim. Southern segregationists, who were rather alarmed by his support for an anti-lynching and anti-poll tax bill, left the Democratic Party and nominated Governor Strom Thurmond from South Carolina as a candidate for their new states' rights or Dixiecrat party. It was a significant step toward the eventual breakup of the Democratic coalition, which had always sort of incomprehensibly included Southern conservatives and Northern liberals, two groups which seemed diametrically opposed to one another. We're finally going to see them break off. Southern conservatives go to the Republican Party following this period. Left-wing Democrats joined with communists to launch a new progressive party headed by Henry Wallace, who was a former vice president. Republicans tried to play it safe, moderating the rather moderate governor of New York, Thomas Dewey. Dewey ran a fairly complacent campaign. It was designed to offend the fewest people, whereas Truman campaigned quite aggressively. And in one of the biggest upset elections in American history, Truman managed to pull out a victory over Dewey. The picture here is rather famous. The Chicago Tribune-Herald quite famously printed their headline that Dewey defeated Truman before they got the final returns, and it was the late returns from California, which ultimately tipped the country in Truman's favor. And so you have a nice picture there of Truman holding up a newspaper proclaiming his defeat when in fact he had won the election. The existence of the progressives and the Dixiecrats actually helped Truman, as their extremism kept most of the moderates very safely in the Democratic fold. None of them were really tempted to go extremely the opposite direction or anything like that. Despite the rather slim victory, Truman proposed a vast new agenda, which he called the Fair Deal. It included things like civil rights, national health care, federal aid to education, and various other sort of social welfare programs. The Fair Deal counted on continual economic growth, as an expanding economic pie would mean a bigger piece for most Americans, and that means they would be willing to allow other people a bigger piece as well, essentially. It would also mean more tax revenue so that the government could pay for all these programs. Prosperity tends to sap public enthusiasm for these kind of liberal reforms, and the bipartisan sort of conservative coalition of Northern Republicans and Southern Democrats managed to defeat many of the programs. They extended to very few of them, such as the minimum wage, extended Social Security, authorized the construction of low-income housing, but didn't go any further, and so the fair deal ultimately sort of puttered out without any real action. So as the Cold War is getting worse, some Americans conclude that the roots of the nation's difficulty abroad lie in domestic treason and subversion. Because how else could the communists have taken over China or gotten the know-how to build their own atomic bomb? And so millions of Americans who were fearful of this idea enlisted in a crusade that would essentially equate any kind of dissent with disloyalty, and created a lot of scapegoats to blame for the nation's problems. The Second Red Scare, as the book describes it, influenced both governmental and personal actions. Americans were subject to security investigations, loyalty oaths, any extremism, anti-communist extremism, destroyed the left, basically, undermined labor militancy, discredited liberalism in general. Any and all progressive initiatives, from health insurance to child care centers to proposals for civil rights, were denounced as socialists or being soft on communism. Foreign and domestic anti-communist policies also reinforced each other. The U.S. Communist Party had claimed about 80,000 members during the Second World War, and no one knew how many of these members occupied sensitive government positions. Mid-1945, a raid on offices of Pro-Communist magazine revealed that classified documents had been given to it by government employees. 10 months later, the Canadian government exposed a spy network that had passed American military information as well as atomic secrets to the Soviets during the war. Recently disclosed Soviet documents revealed that the Russians had spies in the scientific community, as well as highly placed communists operating undercover in the federal government. And this all creates sort of massive hysteria. Republicans accused the Democratic administration of being soft on communism, and in March of 1947, the president issued Executive Order 9835, which established a federal employee loyalty program in order to find all these subversive members of the government. It authorized the Attorney General to prepare a list of subversive organizations and made any kind of association with groups ground for dismissal in order to drive out any of these potential subversives or to find security. We essentially have a complete disregard for civil liberty. Mere criticism of American foreign policy could result in an accusation of disloyalty. People lost jobs because they liked foreign films associated with radical friends or favored unionization of federal workers. And although loyalty boards' probes uncovered no evidence of espionage or subversion, it spread fear among government employees, and the effect on free political debate was that it basically killed it dead. And one of the hallmarks of democracy is the existence of an atmosphere which allows and even encourages free political debate. And so we're rapidly losing our democratic values over this intense fear of communism. The very existence of a federal loyalty probe fed the fears of domestic subversion and served to promote the hysteria, which legitimated this witch hunt, essentially. College administrators cooperated with the FBI in spying on students, as well as faculty. By the end of Truman's term, 39 states had created their own loyalty programs. Very few had any procedural safeguards which protected anyone from being falsely accused or falsely convicted. School teachers, college professors, state and city employees all throughout the nation had to sign loyalty oaths or risk losing their jobs. In 1947, further blurring the distinctions, between dissent and disloyalty, the House Un-American Activities Committee would hold hearings in order to expose communist influence in American life. I mentioned before the case of Hollywood film directors who refused to testify about their past political associations, claiming a right to protection of free speech. The committee had them cited for contempt of Congress and sent to federal prison, and they found themselves on Hollywood blacklists and with no work afterwards. The committee also frightened the labor movement into expelling communists and avoiding progressive causes, fearful of any kind of association with communism. And so they all moved away from politics and focused on things like securing better pay and benefits for their members. In 1948, the presidential election campaign also fed national anxieties. Truman lambasted Wallace as a Stalinist dupe. The GOP dubbed the Democrats as the party of treason. All of this feeding into the fears which are basically controlling Americans. Nothing set off more alarms, though, than the matter of the Alger Hiss Whittaker Chambers incident. In 1948, Chambers, who was a repentant ex-communist, identified Alger Hiss, who was the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, as an underground member of a communist cell. Hiss was eventually found guilty of perjury, although no one could tell the truth from the lies, really, in the trial. The documents that convicted him seemed rather insignificant. And again, it fed the fear. The idea that an eminent official like Hiss had been disloyal intensified the already sort of widespread panic. In February of 1950, the British arrested a German-born scientist who had been involved in the Manhattan Project for passing atomic secrets to the Soviets. His confession, led to the arrest of an American who then also named his brother-in-law and sister, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, as co-conspirators in this spy network. The Rosenbergs insisted that they were victims of anti-Semitism and being persecuted for their left-leaning beliefs, but still a jury found them guilty, and each of them died in the electric chair, like I say, making them the first Americans to be executed for espionage, first American civilians, rather, to be executed for espionage. Eventually, we have the release of classified Soviet documents in the 90s that confirmed that Alger Hiss did actually pass information to the Soviets. It also confirmed that Julius Rosenberg was part of a spy ring, but it appears that Ethel was nothing more than a pawn and actually quite innocent of what she was accused of. By 1950, though, many Americans found it very difficult to separate fact from fantasy with regard to the communist threat. And it's in this atmosphere that you have the entrance of Senator Joseph McCarthy, who comes in and feeds all these fears. He made the claim in one speech that the State Department was simply infested with communist sympathizers. And although he never released any of the names that he claimed to have or any kind of proof, his senatorial stature, the fact that he was a senator, and his rather brazen style of speaking gave him a national forum, and it gave him enough clout that people believed him when they heard him. As the Korean War continues to drag on, McCarthy's efforts to root out the skunks escalates. McCarthyism especially appealed to Midwestern Republicans who were opposed to democratic internationalism and restrictions on business. For them, anti-communism was a weapon of revenge against liberals and a means to regain political dominance in the country. McCarthy also won a rather devoted following among blue-collar workers who felt that all true Americans detested communists and queers. He also had a following among Catholic ethnics, who sought acceptance as 100% American, which had kind of always been called into question previously. Countless Americans also shared his scorn for the State Department liberals as the bright young men with silver spoons in their mouths. His theory offered a very simple answer as well to the rather perplexing questions of the Cold War, that the fault was in Washington. It gave everyone a scapegoat for our problems as they existed, and that was a very attractive prospect. McCarthy's political power rested on both the Republican establishment as well as Democratic fears of antagonizing him. Over Truman's veto, Congress managed to adopt the McCarran Internal Security Act, which required organizations deemed communist by the Attorney General to actually register with the Department of Justice. And so, again, the subversion of civil rights and civil liberties. As I mentioned in class, McCarthy finally overreaches himself when he goes after the Department of Defense and the Army in particular, and manages to completely discredit himself in the hearings, and he is eventually officially censored in the Senate by a vote of 67 to 22, and he's pretty much, as a political force, completely diminished by that time. In 1952, public apprehension about the loyalty of government employees combines with the frustration of the long stalemated Korean War to basically sink any Democratic hopes they had of winning the election in that year. Truman was far too unpopular to run for re-election, and so the Democrats, somewhat unenthusiastically, nominated, is the word I'm looking for, Adlai Stevenson from Illinois. Compounding the Democratic woes, the GOP nominated the rather hugely popular Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a war hero, was a well-recognized general, everyone respected him, and so against a figure like that, the Democrats really had no hope. He chose as his running mate Richard Nixon, who had won a seat in the Senate in 1950, largely by red-baiting his opponent. Eisenhower and Nixon proved an unbeatable combination. Less than 2 weeks before the election, Eisenhower dramatically pledged to go to Korea in order to end the stalemated war. It turned out to be a very good gambit, as 62.7% of those eligible to vote actually voted, compared to just over 50% in the previous election, and gave him a 55% vote of confidence in the ballots. Eisenhower managed to crack the solid South by carrying 39 states. Enough Republicans rode his coattails as well to give the GOP rather narrow control of both houses of Congress as well. Most Americans in the 1950s did not venture terribly far to the right. They voted for a president who would steer a moderate course, and Eisenhower was the perfect candidate for that. Americans crave stability and peace after years of being pulled this way and that, with fear and hysteria and things like that. And Eisenhower focused quite a lot on trying to calm these fears and tensions. His approach to the presidency reflected his wartime leadership style. He concentrated on major matters, delegated authority, and worked to reconcile any contending factions. The image of passivity that he sort of projected masked his rather sort of hidden hand, which directed everything, and enabled him to work rather successfully behind the scenes. He was more pragmatic, really, than ideological, wished to reduce taxes to contain inflation, and when necessary, to check downturns in the economy by stimulating it further. After the Democrats retook Congress in 1954, Eisenhower supported liberal objectives like extending Social Security benefits, raising the minimum wage, adding about 4 million workers to those eligible for unemployment benefits, providing federally funded public housing, He also approved construction of massive sort of internal improvement projects, created a Department of Health, Department of Education, and a Department of Welfare to deal with those things, and quite famously undertook one of the largest and most expensive public works programs in American history, the Interstate Highway Act, which authorized the construction of our interstate highways, essentially. Republicans renominated him overwhelmingly in 1956, and voters gave him another landslide victory, again against Stevenson. And so he proved to be a very easy, very steady, very popular president. As far as the Cold War and foreign policy went, he essentially maintained Truman's containment policy, but with one major change. Truman's policy of containment relied very heavily on quite a lot of money, a fair amount of men, and was generally very costly to the United States. Eisenhower tweaked the policy just slightly with his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, by basically shifting focus from a manpower-based policy to one that relied much more extensively on nuclear weapons. It became known as massive retaliation. This kind of sort of saber rattling essentially pleased the far right, but Eisenhower personally preferred conciliation, partly to keep the cost of containment down, and partly because he feared a nuclear war. His military experience led him to fear a nuclear war. Eisenhower refused to translate Dulles' rhetoric into action in a lot of places, refusing to actively go in and use American nuclear power. As thermonuclear weapons replaced atomic bombs in both arsenals, both nations developed intercontinental ballistic missiles to carry these bombs, and Eisenhower worked very hard to try and reduce the probability of any kind of mutual annihilation. And it's in this that we get the meeting between he and Soviet leaders in Geneva. Discussions produced no real concrete plan for any kind of arms control, but mutual talk of peaceful coexistence led a lot of reporters to hail the spirit of Geneva as being a much more peaceful one. In March of 1958, Moscow suspended atmospheric tests of nuclear weapons, and the United States followed suit, and so you have some movement forward there. Eisenhower's new defense program reduced conventional forces and also, like I say, heavily emphasized nuclear weapons. It succeeded in reducing the defense budget, but it spurred the arms race on, as our focus on nuclear weapons led the Soviets to seek more and more to build an even larger nuclear stockpile for themselves. He oversaw the creation of SEATO, which is essentially NATO but in Southeast Asia, extending the agreement that the United States already had with Australia and New Zealand to countries like Pakistan, the Philippines, Thailand, and things like that. Under Eisenhower, we see the focus of the Cold War start to shift as well. Europe becomes less central now, and the third world is where we see more and more action happening. Established in 1947, the CIA soon becomes the sort of main operative for carrying out undercover operations, which basically define the Cold War. In order to woo influential foreign thinkers away from communism, the CIA would sponsor intellectual conferences, jazz concerts. It bankrolled anti-communist cultural events, subsidized magazines to publish articles that supported the United States, recruited college students as well as businessmen that traveled abroad frequently as fronts for CIA activities. essentially hiring them as rather inexperienced foreign operatives. In 1953, the CIA orchestrated a coup to overthrow the government of Iran. They replaced him with the rather pro-American Shah Pahlavi. The United States gained a loyal ally on the Soviet border in the form of the Shah, but they antagonized the Iranian people, who didn't particularly like our involvement and didn't particularly like the Shah either. And so problems that result in Iran that we even deal with today can be traced back to our actions here. The CIA also intervened in the Philippine elections in 1953 to produce a pro-American government. They supported a band of mercenaries in Guatemala to overthrow the elected communist-influenced regime, and other actions as well, which were somewhat subversive in nature. In Indochina, it became more and more viewed as a major battleground for the Cold War, and Eisenhower first followed Truman's course as far as providing the French with military assistance in fighting Vietnamese insurgents. When that failed, he pinned most of his hopes on the CIA-installed President, Diem, to keep South Vietnam as an independent anti-communist nation that was tied to the United States. But that policy, too, even appeared to be faltering as Eisenhower left office. His biggest crisis, however, happened in the Middle East. In 1954, Nasser, who was came to power in Egypt, and he was determined to modernize Egypt. The U.S. offered financing for a dam to harness the Nile River, which Nasser graciously accepted, but he also purchased arms from Czechoslovakia, and by extension, the Soviet Union. In retaliation, the State Department canceled the loan for the dam, and in response to that, Nasser nationalized the British-controlled Suez Canal. The British and the French moved in and attacked Egypt because of their nationalization of the canal, and Eisenhower was very upset about that. He managed to persuade the British to back off, the British and the French to back off, essentially. But the Suez Crisis had major consequences. It pretty much expanded anti-Western sentiment in the Third World. The United States had managed to replace Britain and France as the protector of Western interests in the Middle East, and so they had also replaced the British and the French as the least favorite Western country in the Middle East. In order to guarantee the flow of oil to the West, the president announced the Eisenhower Doctrine in 1957, stating that the United States would send military aid and, if necessary, troops to any Middle Eastern nation threatened by communist aggression, meaning, as well, that any nation which democratically elected a communist government or anything like that was subject to violent overthrow by the United States, which is, I'm sure, how most Middle Eastern people heard that doctrine. Such interventions intensified anti-American feelings in third world nations around the world, actually. For example, when Vice President Nixon visited Peru and Venezuela, he found crowds which spat at him and threw stones at his car and otherwise showed their wrath towards American policy. In 1959, Fidel Castro managed to overturn the dictatorial regime in Cuba, the U.S.-backed dictatorial regime in Cuba, and confiscate American properties there without compensation. He then buddied up quite closely to the Soviet Union and its new premier, Nikita Khrushchev, who warned that he would defend Cuba with nuclear weapons if necessary. A tougher blow came on May 1st, 1960, 2 weeks before a scheduled summit conference between Eisenhower and Khrushchev, when the Soviet air defenses shot down a U.S. spy plane far inside their border. And it's in fact that, or at least part of that idea, that there's a new film out in theaters now called Bridge of Spies. And it deals with the American flying the spy plane that had been shot down in the Soviet Union. Khrushchev displayed pictures of the captured CIA pilot and photos taken of Soviet missile sites at the conference where they were meeting. Eisenhower refused to apologize or anything like that, and the summit very quickly collapsed after that. Just before leaving office, though, Eisenhower offered Americans a farewell address and a warning as well, much in the style of George Washington. The demands of national security, he stated, had produced a conjunction of an immense military establishment and large arms industry, and he warned specifically about the power of the military-industrial complex, this very close relationship between the military and industry. He concluded that in his time in office he had avoided war, but was still very far away from actually achieving peace. However, he had given the majority of Americans what they most wanted, which was prosperity, reassurance, and a bit of a breather from all of the fear and hysteria which had characterized at least the last portion of Truman's presidency.